Hi, thank you for joining the Haggadah online class through the Conservative Yeshiva. My name is Joshua Kulp. Some people like to call me Dr. Joshua Kulp. Please don't call me Dr. Joshua Kulp to my face. Just call me Josh. I will be the teacher for this year, and I wanted to give you a few introductory remarks, a little bit about the Haggadah, about the Seder, things that we're going to be talking about throughout our learning together. But first of all, I wanted to show you who I am. I am, among other things, the author of a book called the Haggadah Shechter, the Shechter Haggadah, which is, I co-authored this with Rabbi Professor David Golinkin. There are several sections to the Haggadah. One that Rabbi Golinkin authored is the text accompanied by hundreds of pictures from classical Haggadot from the Middle Ages and from the later period, with illustrations where Rabbi Golinkin explains the illustrations. It's a unique production. There are a lot of Haggadot that are illustrated, but very few of them have critical explanations where these Haggadot come from, what you see in the pictures. It's an educational tool I use with my kids every year. The second half of the Haggadah is my commentary, where I go through basically all of the customs and all of the texts that are in the Haggadah that we do at the Seder, how they originated and how they developed, mostly in the Talmudic period, the Talmudic period being from 200 to, let's say, the year 500-600 CE, but a little bit after that as well, just to try to answer the question, how did the Seder, the Haggadah, one of the most well-known rituals in the Jewish tradition, how did it get to be the way it is today? And that's basically, in a nutshell, what we're going to be doing in the Shiur. We're going to try to look through certain aspects of the Haggadah and the Seder, and we're going to try to get to see how did they develop to be the way they are observed to this day. Now, I wanted to bring up at least 5 introductory remarks that will sort of put us in the context of the kinds of things that we're going to be talking about in this year, the kinds of texts we're going to be learning. First of all, 2 terms, the Haggadah, which is the text, the Hagid. Magid means to tell. So Haggadah are the recitations, not necessarily written texts. They were originally oral texts. We'll talk about that in a moment. That were recited by Jews, or were supposed to be recited by Jews at the table on Pesach evening. And the second term is the Seder. Seder means order, and it specifically refers to a properly ordered meal, the way that one is supposed to order their meal. And in the context of rabbinic literature and the culture in which the rabbis lived, this would include things like when to recline, when to sit, so that's the eating posture, washing of hands, when to eat certain foods, when to dip certain foods, things to talk about, when to drink the wine, how to drink the wine, who to invite, where people sit. Basically, all of the sort of proper aspects of a meal that today would come out more in things like, when we sit in a proper meal, where do we put the fork? Where do we put the knife? What side of the table do we put what side of the table do we put them on? What about the drinking cups? What types of drinking cups? What types of plates do we use? Do we bring the food to the table buffet style, or do we bring individual plates? These are all sorts of things that we sort of take for granted. You know, if you sit at a table and you see that there are plastic utensils there, then you know that you're not at a particularly formal meal. If you see that there are 3 forks, then you know that you're at a more formal meal. If the napkin is folded in a fancy way, you know how to identify where you are. And the same is true for the meals that are referred to in rabbinic literature. So we'll be looking a lot at some of those particular rules that are part of the Seder, what makes this a Seder, not just a regular meal. So that's the first thing. The second thing, maybe we'll get into 6 actually, is that the Haggadah and the Seder as we know it were created as a in the post-destruction period, after the destruction of the temple, after 70 CE. As far as we know, while the temple still stood, Jews would go to Jerusalem, eat the Korban Pesach, the Pesach sacrifice, somewhere inside of the city of Jerusalem. It would be accompanied by things like wine and singing. But there is no historical record of any of the other elements of the Pesach meal that we're familiar with from the Mishnah of the Seder being observed in Jerusalem during the time of the Second Temple period. That means there's no discussion of how many cups of wine, when to wash your hand, ritually recited texts. Many of the things that make the meal a Seder and not a sacrificial meal are just simply never found in any of the historical records, including Josephus, Philo, the writings of the Christians, the Bible, right, the later books of the Bible. None of these things include anything that really resembles all that much a Seder. So that is my belief that the Seder, as the rabbis describe it, is something that they created in the post-destruction period, and that informs a lot of the shiurim that we're going to be learning today. It was created in a Greco-Roman context. That means that the rabbis of the Mishnah and of the Tosefta, a text that accompanies the Mishnah, who lived between the years 70 CE and let's say 200, 220 CE, lived in Eretz Israel, which was a part of the world that was heavily influenced by Greeks and the Romans, which means that rabbis basically were, to a certain extent, Greeks and Romans. They ate in the way that Greeks and Romans ate. They ate foods that the Greeks and Romans ate. They expected to act in a meal much in the same way that Greeks and Romans did. So many of the customs that we find in the Mishnah and in the Tosefta, and in the later period as well, developed or created in the Greco-Roman context, whether we call that a banquet or a symposium, which is basically just a banquet with formalized discussion. Many scholars, I'm certainly not the first, who have noticed the great deal of similarity between the Seder, the rabbi's banquet, and the Greco-Roman banquet. So we will be talking about that as we go through. I want to clarify, this doesn't mean that I think that the rabbis were borrowing non-Jewish customs. That's in my opinion, that's a misleading way of looking at things. What I would say rather is that the rabbis simply are Greeks and Romans to a certain extent, and they are participating in Greek and Roman culture the same way that many other people throughout the world participated in Greek and Roman culture, giving it their own color, their own rules, but doing it in a very typical Greek and Roman way. Davar Shlishi, really the third thing, is that Haggadot were not composed, Haggadah, I mean a written book, were not composed until the Gaonic period, until about 800 CE, and in the periods following that, the same time when the first Sidurim were composed. So when we talk about the history of the text of the Haggadah, we have to divide it into several different periods. The earliest text, the text in the Mishnah and the Talmud, would have been an oral text, a completely oral text. In other words, if you came to a Seder in, let's say, the 4th century, you did not sit down with a book. No one at the table of the book had a book. No one in Jewish world had a book of the Haggadah. These were things that either you knew by heart or you didn't know by heart, and you recited them as well as you possibly knew them, but you did not sit down with a book. Now, this also influences the history of the text, right? Once the texts are written, so let's say I'm sitting in Babylonia in 950 CE, and I send out a text to North Africa because somebody in North Africa says, Rabbi, I want a text of the Haggadah. So I write to him, text of the Haggadah, I send it to him. Then he wants to use that text. So let's say he makes 10 copies, gives them out to all of his friends. But his friends, maybe they know some other things that are supposed to be there in the Haggadah. So they write them into their Haggadah. And other people write them into their Haggadah. And a copy from North Africa comes to Italy. And somebody comes to North Africa from Eretz Israel and starts to compare the Palestinian Eretz Israeli version of the Haggadah with the Babylonian version of the Haggadah. And all of this sort of crisscross traveling of Jews from one land to the other, combinations of traditions, that leads to the environment that we have in Europe of all sorts of creations of new combinations of new texts, a great development of the text. We'll be getting into that a little bit, but not all that much, because we'll be looking more at the earlier period, the Talmudic period. Of course, much of this development of the text of the Haggadah ended when the printing press arose in the 15th century, when the earliest Jewish printers decided this is the version that they're going to print, at least the Ashkenazi version or maybe the Sephardi version. They printed those versions, and there was far, far less development of the text of the Haggadah. Not no development, but far less development in the post-printing press era. The same exact thing would be true of the Siddur. Finally, Be'ofen Kali in general, the study of the Haggadah and of the Seder, it's really a study of the history of the Jewish people, and that's what I think makes it so fascinating. Jews, wherever we are, whether we're in Babylonia or North Africa or Italy or France or America or South Africa or England, right? Wherever we are in the world, we tend to act in certain ways and live our lives in certain ways, including eating meals and eating foods that are similar to the people around us. Clearly, this is very, very true with food, gefilte fish, matzah balls. These are Eastern European foods. They're not Jewish foods per se. They're Eastern European foods. Hummus and pita, I grew up thinking they were Jewish foods, and found out when I moved to Israel that they were Middle Eastern foods and had nothing to do with being Jewish. It just happened to be that in America, where I was from, mostly the Jews, I knew Jews, who ate pita and hummus when they could find them. So that's a little bit about why I think it's so interesting to learn about the history of the Haggadah and the Seder. I will be accompanying you throughout all of these texts. You'll hear my questions, but I especially encourage you to ask questions on the website. I will try to be there as much as possible to answer your questions. You can buy the book, the Schechter Haggadah, either on Amazon, or you can Google Schechter Haggadah and order it directly from Machon Schechter. There are other various places where you can find it. If I happen to come across you and you have a copy, I'd be happy to sign it for you. I like to do that so I can see who is using it. And good luck and enjoy your learning.